Alright, ladies and gentlemen, now that we've talked about the social, political, and economics impacts of the Reformation, now we have to go back and talk about how other factors in Europe, social, political, and economic, were aggravating things that happened during the Reformation and how the Reformation impacted those events. Mostly, we're going to start talking about wars caused by religion. This video specifically is going to talk about wars in the 16th century in France and Spain, and then when you come back to class, we're going to talk about the wars in England. A couple of big themes to keep in mind as we talk about these wars. First, we're going to talk about the causes, then we're going to talk about some aggravating factors, and then we'll do a little bit of foreshadowing and talk about what kind of governments are going to emerge in Europe after these wars are over. Okay, first cause, of course, is going to be the Reformation, specifically as Calvinism and Catholicism became more militant. Both parties were willing to fight each other and instigate rebellions within countries. Although we should remember with some of the previous popes, Catholicism was already increasingly militant, able to raise large armies in order to meet their goals. The next cause simply has to do with the scope of the Reformation. It's important to remember that religious conflicts in Europe did not have boundaries. This means that whenever there is a religious conflict between Calvinism, Protestantism, and or Catholicism in one country, that is generally going to bleed over into other countries and create even more conflicts. Second big theme, we have to remember that there are aggravating factors making conflicts surrounding the Reformation even more involved. You could technically call these causes, but we've already learned about some of these, and it's important to remember that everything is happening at the same time. This unit is not as chronological as the other. First aggravating factor, as we learned during the Middle Ages, Catholicism and the Catholic Church was increasingly involved in the power of secular governments. So whenever somebody makes a religious statement or event, it's also going to be a political statement. For example, when Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church, it not only meant that he was establishing his own church, it also meant that he was confiscating church land and resources that existed in England. The second aggravating factor was the continued economic crisis for two reasons. First of all, the Little Ice Age that began in the 15th century during the Middle Ages was still ongoing. Farming produce was down, and people were scrambling to find ways to make up that lost trade revenue in addition to keeping the peasantry happy. And it was also a problem because governments were trying to expand and consolidate their power still. They're finding ways to tax more people, they're finding ways for their countries to get more resources for wars, and then they can go back and fight more wars for even more resources. The final aggravating factor was the changing social landscape in Europe for two reasons. First of all, people were leaving the continent to go and start colonies in the New World. Second of all, there was a very, very slow growing middle class, and the peasantry that used to be made up of mostly serfs was being replaced by independent farmers who were poor but nevertheless not tied to the land. The final big theme, and this is just something to keep in mind for later in the unit, is the rise of absolutist governments. The religious instability and the many civil wars that arose because of the Reformation create the political will necessary for governments to take more and more power away from the aristocracy and hold it in their own hands as they promise stability. Fantastic. Let's go to France. First, we need a quick definition to start ourselves off about the difference between a civil war and a revolution. A civil war is a war between two groups within the same nation. Basically, a civil war is an unsuccessful revolution, where a group of people want to break off, but afterwards the country stays together, so they usually call it a civil war. And that's what was going on in France. We can divide the causes of the French wars of religion, these civil wars, into two groups, religious and political. The first religious cause of the French wars of religion was the persecution of the Huguenots. Huguenots were what the French people called French Calvinists. So these are not Lutherans, but other Protestants trying to break off from the Catholic Church. Huguenots were a religious minority in France. They were only about 7% of the population, so you wouldn't think they would cause too much trouble for the government. But the problem was that the aristocracy, the nobility, the group of people that was supposed to be maintaining order on behalf of the king, were 40 to 50% Huguenot. You can see this as a religious revolution or as a way for the aristocracy to fight back against the growing power of the French monarchy. On to the political causes of the French wars for religion. The main political cause was a conflict between the two leading aristocratic families in France, the Bourbons and the Valois family. The Bourbon house, who were next in line for succession, were Huguenot. On the other hand, the Valois family, that actually controlled the throne, were Catholic. The reason that historians have given this series of civil wars the name the French Wars for Religion is that it was really long, it lasted 30 years, and there were a lot of them. Without getting bogged down in the details of these dynastic successions and local conflicts, there is one important thing I want to mention, and that is the use of propaganda, which was for the first time able to be widely distributed using the new technology of the printing press. For example, here is some Huguenot propaganda depicting Spanish Catholics harming natives in the New World and generally looking like oppressors. Here on the left, we have some Huguenot propaganda about the Catholic massacre of the city at Merindol. This city was apparently exclusively populated by damsels in distress wearing white dresses. And then over here on the right, we have Huguenots throwing the helpless Catholics overboard as they innocently clutch on to their religious items. The war finally ended in 1589 when Henry IV of Navarre, who was of the Bourbon dynasty, succeeded to the throne. However, Henry IV was very politically savvy as well as religiously so. He realized that he wouldn't be accepted by the rest of France even though he had won most of the war, all but Paris. So he looked around him and he converted to Catholicism, supposedly saying that Paris is well worth a mass. A little over a decade later, Henry of Navarre signed the Edict of Nantes, which declared that Catholicism was the official religion of France. However, Calvinism was protected, and Calvinists, all of those aristocrats, were allowed to hold office. Alright, now we have to talk about Spain, Philip II, and the further development of militant Catholicism. Philip II was not just King of Spain, but as the son of Charles V, he was also the Holy Roman Emperor. That meant that he owned Spain, as well as parts of northern Italy, the Netherlands, and also territory in the New World. Philip II was your classic character who actually believed in the title Holy Roman Emperor. He believed that with enough military strength and political legitimacy, he could govern all of Europe, providing unity through Catholicism. So his main goal was to provide a strict and strengthened monarchy and also strengthen Catholicism at the same time, beginning in the territories that he controlled, particularly the Netherlands. So, keeping in mind Philip II's goal of a united Catholic Europe, let's evaluate his reign, his successes, and his failures. Warning, there are going to be more failures than there are successes. His main success was by unifying the Holy League, a group of Catholic monarchs, and going and fighting the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Lepanto. The Holy League won the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, and this battle is largely credited with the event that stopped Ottoman expansion into the northern Mediterranean, and perhaps stopped the Ottoman from taking over all of Europe. Alright, on to Philip II's failures. Philip II tried to strengthen his authority in the Spanish and thus Holy Roman Empire-controlled Netherlands. The Netherlands was composed of modern Holland and Belgium. He was trying to strengthen his authority by ending Calvinism. However, when he put anti-Calvinist policies in place, the nobles of the region rebelled. This revolt was led by a guy who will be very important later, named William of Orange I, also known as William the Silent. One of the main reasons that the Dutch won this war was because England sent troops and ships to help fight the Spanish. There were two reasons that England would want to do this. First of all, because England was now, by then, a fellow Protestant nation, having left the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. And then second of all, the English really, really hated the Spanish. And going by the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, they were willing to provide some financial support to the Dutch. In 1609, Philip II was forced to sign a truce with the Spanish nobles that ended the war. This truce had two effects. First of all, the northern provinces, which is what today is modern Holland, gained their independence. Belgium, however, stayed in the hands of the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire. Next, Philip II's most spectacular failure. This failure not only lost Philip II a war in his navy, but really is seen as the end of the Spanish Empire, their dominance in Europe, and their dominance in the New World. This, of course, is the defeat of the Spanish Armada. As I said earlier, Spain and England were old enemies. Both were battling for control and influence on the continent. There were two reasons why Philip II thought that Spain was strong enough to actually go and invade England. First of all, many of his advisors told him that most of the people in England were actually anti-Protestant, and if the Spanish invaded, they would quickly rise up and join the Spanish Catholic forces against the Protestant queen. Second of all, he was definitely being egged on by the Pope, who stated against Elizabeth II that whoever sends her out of the world with the pious intention of doing God's service not only does not sin, but gains merit. In other words, whoever assassinates a queen gets this one free ticket to heaven. And by Elizabeth II, I of course mean Elizabeth I. As you guys learned during the last unit, the English were relatively easily able to beat the small and quite flammable Spanish navy for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Spanish fleet was much smaller than planned, both because Philip II lost some funds and because a significant portion of his navy was destroyed while still in port by the so-called Protestant wind that came and destroyed the Catholic ships. Next, during the main battle, a fire broke out that destroyed even more of the Spanish ships. Embarrassingly for the Spanish, the English navy was primarily composed by a group of people called privateers. Privateers were essentially pirates. They were independent ship captains, sometimes hired by governments to work in their navy. These privateers were specifically hired by the British government to harass Spanish ships. One of the most hated privateers was a guy named Sir Francis Drake. The Spanish particularly hated this person because he stole tons and tons of Spanish silver from those mines at Potosi, and then he was knighted on the deck of a stolen Spanish ship by Queen Elizabeth I. These privateers had smaller, more maneuverable ships that allowed them to outgun, outpace, and of course outmaneuver the Spanish ships before, during, and after the battle. And just in case you thought that Spain wasn't already having enough bad luck, as they tried to retreat away from the battle they just lost, they ran into another slew of storms north of the coast of Ireland, and these destroyed pretty much the rest of the Spanish fleet. What all of these events add up to is the end of Spanish dominance in England. This makes way for the successful reign of Queen Elizabeth I and the emergence of England as the next world superpower.